Good afternoon. Welcome to the Red Hen Press Reading and Conversation in the Afternoon. For some of you who might be watching on the East Coast, it's Red Hen Reading and Conversation in the evening. We're very glad to have you all with us, and especially with these two amazing poets, Francisco Aragón and Felicia Zamora. Both of them are wonderful poets. Francisco's been with Red Hen for a long time, guiding us and bringing us wonderful Latinx poets. He's the one that introduced us to the whole idea of having a Latinx series. And this series has completely electrified what Red Hen was doing in terms of our publishing series. And he's also the person who first mentioned Felicia Zamora to me. And I started following her poetry and watching what she was doing. And at some point, she ended up entering her book, Body of Render, in the Benjamin Saltman Award. But I hadn't seen any of those poems anywhere, and so I didn't recognize it as being hers. But when her book ended up in the final five, I was pretty excited. And her book was selected by Marilyn Nelson to win our prestigious Benjamin Saltman Award. And we couldn't have been more thrilled to be able to work with Felicia Zamora on this prize. So we've gotten to work with Francisco Aragón in a number of different ways, both with our prize-winning poets and now with his book, After Ruben, which has been such a joy. So without further ado, please welcome Felicia Zamora, who will be reading to us from her prize-winning book.
Thanks, Kate. I really appreciate all that Red Hen Press has been doing, especially now. Toby, you are behind the scenes, but I just want to recognize you because it is really difficult to sort of run a show, let alone run the press that you're doing right now. And it's a tough time for everybody, and I just want to acknowledge that. So if you're at home and if you're watching this, thanks so much for sharing space with us. I'm going to read a couple poems from my book, Body of Render, that just came out. I also want to give a shout out to all of those authors who are publishing books, and books are being launched right now during this really, really horrible time. Books are one thing, but people are dying. And I'm so glad to be able to have this book into the world, but I completely understand that it's a time period where we're looking for art, right? We're looking for joy. We're looking for something that will make us feel more connected, even in all of this social distancing. So the two poems I'm going to read today are actually quite intimate in the book. The book really explores sort of what had happened after the 2016 election, which is relevant now just as it was in 2016, 2017 and beyond. We're in a country with broken systems. We're being run by a president who is a misogynist, racist, unbelievable human being, and we've allowed it to happen for 4 years, and I've just been really confused about it, and I think a lot of people are. And this is the election year, and Body of Render is coming out this year. I have to believe that it's not a coincidence. And so these two pieces are intimate toward me as both the writer and artist, because beyond the themes of what happened after the election, it's dealing with what is it like to be a person of color in this country right now with a president who, believes that I'm a dirty animal. But it also has some themes of the healthcare system that's broken, and we're witnessing it every single day right now during COVID. It also has themes of addiction, and it has themes of being biracial and otherness and what that means. This first poem is called The Retreat. Inside the circle of 70 people, inside a cage of ribs, your lungs tick in spasmodic rhythm. Heave, your chest repeats over and over, a hymn of sorts. And you, atheist, in pretend that belief ever calmed anything. Outside the panes, snow pummels the mountain range. Sidewalks, the air so crisp, you choke on its necessity. And the room builds a ladder of terms with no destination. Privilege, identity, socialization, liberation, biracial, horizontal oppression, justice. You pluck them from each breath to stow each away. How you fear your own memory a sieve, separating the fine parts and loose matter of you. How you always in assembly and deconstruction. This cycle in force, and you are. How you came to facilitate, yet this discussion tears pieces away of you. And someone says white passing, and how a familiar voice alludes, and your mind dives back into his words, you dirty little spick. How he, of all people, designed in blood to love you. And the fear and the small hands and push of your small body, how you always told other, how spit saved for you, how knuckles cut your cheekbones, how yes, you Latina, and the word white lingers in your temporal lobe in search of meaning thrown toward you again. How violence, so simply stated, and two words in weight unravel your identity here in space with strangers. Your mind chants, I am enough, I am enough, enough, enough. And the second piece is I had a loved one who was suffering from addiction and clinical depression. And if you have an existence where you are trying to navigate the systems of healthcare, especially for mental health, you may find it lacking completely. And you're asked to make some hard decisions about what life is at that time based on what's offered to you when it comes to services and to help. This is called Mathematics of Healing, a poem to America. Yes, the gape of wounds exists, and yet how wounds elevate both flesh and mind, transform to causeways, making us stony. So much to harden from. Today, the rehab office speaks to you in costs, addiction held up against the window for all to see, and what light shows through. The familiar symbol of capitalism, say dollar sign, dollar sign, dollar sign, and you weigh your partner's health against a price the weight of your heart and sag, a price that makes you speak in equations. Say, price greater than your current mortgage. Say, if I cannot afford, do I still love? How some systems wrench us. And what of systems in manipulation? Of numbers never adding up. Say, oh, healthcare, oh. Say, capitalism, for whom? Say, freedom, and what of afford? A nation overjoyed to make you poverty-bound, environmentally sick, an addict. And what of healing? Our nation offers that too, if your pockets run just deep enough. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Thanks, Red Hen, for hosting this. Toby, Kate, all the work that you do is wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is just amazing. I love both of those poems so much. And I'm so delighted to turn to Francisco. Francisco, I love this book so much, and I love you so much for making it. You are someone, we'll get to this later, but you are someone who I don't know how you have time to write because you are carrying the world on your shoulders. So maybe we'll get to that in a moment. But for now, I'm looking forward to you reading to us from this amazing book, After Ruben.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you all for tuning in to Red Hen Press's Spring Book Tour. I'm going to read 3 poems from After Ruben. They're from section 1 of the book. And if there's a common thread that runs through the 3 of them, it's that they're each implicitly touching upon the theme of immigration to differing degrees. The first poem is titled Postcard. Just a few notes. There's a reference to the pyramid, and that refers to the Transamerica Pyramid, which is one of San Francisco's iconic skyscrapers. There's also a reference to a park that's near where I grew up, Dolores Park. And from one corner of that park, you get a terrific panoramic view of San Francisco's financial district. There's also a reference to Treasure Island, which is a man-made island on San Francisco Bay through which the Bay Bridge traverses. Postcard. Blue sky, the Bay Bridge from afar, arcing like a bow to Treasure Island. City skyline, scoring a view tourists could buy at Fisherman's Wharf, but for the smudge clouding the tip of the pyramid, panels deflecting the sun glint through as if a beacon shrouded in fog were blinking a code to this green slope, park named after a mission. Dolores, Dolores, it simmers on my tongue, is pains in Spanish, is her name. And beyond the grass, a dark-haired woman crouching in the sand, saying to a small boy, "Sácate los dedos de la boca." Take your fingers out of your mouth. When I was a small boy, 3 or 4, my mother's mother came to live with us in San Francisco from Nicaragua. She stayed with us for about 6 months and then went back. Years later, I asked my mother why her mother decided to return to Nicaragua and not stay with us. And her answer to that question is what inspired this poem. There's a reference made to BART, B-A-R-T, which is an acronym for Bay Area Rapid Transit. There's also a reference to 24th and Mission, which is an intersection in the Mission District of San Francisco, which is well known. And the last utterance of this poem is the name of a town just outside Managua, Nicaragua, where my grandmother returned to. The title of the poem begins the poem. Reasons why she didn't stay. Pavement was one, and doors. A front door beyond which 24th and Mission blared. The preacher at the BART station's concrete lip seemed odd to her, the way most mornings he was pretty much ignored. Mama is arm in arm with her, a walk she'll take on her own in tipitapa. And the third and final poem I'd like to share with you this evening is titled Jugglers. It's a poem that attempts to enact how memory sometimes functions in us. We might find ourselves just going through our day, and we might see or hear or smell something that dislodges a memory we thought long forgotten, but somehow it's jolted to the surface of our consciousness in a way that sort of surprises us. Jugglers. And the poem is dedicated to my mother, who passed away in 1997. Jugglers. She and I on a bench, peeling prawns. The first day of her 50th year, and she points at street performers about to juggle fire. And a distant summer morning surfaces, afloat on the light wind blowing off the bay. Older sisters in the dark, hiding, as big brother parades around the house, his hands outstretched, clutching large candles. I'm on a search, he shouts, marching from room to room, till he finds them huddling in a jungle of clothes. Beacons flickering as flame hot wax begins to flow across his fingers, while she is walking to Centro Adulto, her head brimming with phrases, the words she needs so she can quit sewing, land a job in a bank. And the sitter arriving minutes late, finding us wet and trying to save a coat, a shirt, a dress. It's a small one, nothing the green hose and frantic assembly line of buckets doesn't eventually douse, leaving walls and curtains the color of coal. Mira, she gasps, her left hand wrapping my shoulder, still pointing with the right, as the torches from one juggler to the other begin to fly. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for those readings. So great to be here with both of you. So I wanted to chat with you both about a few things. Let's start with you, Felicia. So how's it been going for you during this time of COVID? I know you teach, and you were mentioning before we started the show that you are in the middle of changing jobs. So that just sounds like challenges keep on more challenges. So tell us how it's all been going.
I think a great example of how it's going is that after I read, I got a quick message from my partner who is in Ohio right now. We're moving to Ohio, and said he's watching and that I was great. And I started bawling, like I'm trying to hold it together right now. And I think that's really indicative of the moment. Is like at any given time, I'll just break into tears for no reason. But there is a reason, right? Because we're all struggling. I think the biggest thing I want to let people know is that, like, you're not okay. It's okay to be not okay. This is it's horrible, right? And so I think that for me, I'm trying to find joy in like every little thing I can, and I'm also tired because I'm overworking myself on a couple too many different things, trying to keep my mind off of the fear of what's going on and people getting sick and feeling like we have no control over it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you've been teaching on Zoom?
Well, so I teach online. So actually my class didn't have as big of an impact when everything had to shift online, but my students were still, we had conversations and I just told them, if you need to turn in things late, if you need extensions, if, just tell me, because how are any of us supposed to really be focusing on things right now? It's really hard. I'm not gonna read my poems and then just say, oh, things are all right. No, they're not all right. I think it's barely bearable at the moment.
Right.
And I think that when we talk as a society about pushing being busy and pushing being like, oh, it's all, we can just get through this, and we will get through this. But I think being honest of our emotions and being able to say, like, nah, it's a shit show. I think that that's okay.
Yeah. And part of the strain of it is obviously the economic strain. And we all now have people in our lives who are dependent on us that maybe weren't before, that maybe were financially independent before. And how are you doing, Francisco?
Hanging in there. I wanted to answer this question by sharing a little story about a friend of mine, dear friend of mine, who passed away last Saturday. He did not pass away from COVID-19, but the last couple of months of his life were greatly impacted by COVID-19. His name was Wally Babington, and he lived in a care home, nursing home, care home, senior assistance living situation here in Washington for the last year and a half or so. And his office was close to my office. I'd visit him quite often. But when the pandemic kicked in fully, his world shrunk. He could no longer receive visitors. His communal dining room shut down, so they had to deliver all his meals to his studio apartment. So I got into the habit of calling him on the phone once or twice a day. And I got into the habit of reading poems to him. And I read to him from this book, the poems of Cavafy, wonderful poet from the Greek. But about 3 weeks ago, his daughter decided to move him to a care home in Minnesota where she lived. And so our phone calls, was from calling him from here to there. But last week, he had a stroke and he was put into hospice care. Thankfully, the facility he was living in allowed his daughter and son-in-law to be with him at the end. So I wanted to just share that story as sort of one way that this pandemic were it not for this pandemic, I would have been able to visit him in person. And I want to share one of the poems that I read to him quite often. He had short-term memory problems, so sometimes, even though I'd read a poem to him the day before, he'd not remember it. So he would get to enjoy it anew every time he heard it. And Wally was a big theater person, and probably the activity we most shared was going to the theater in Washington, but also in New York and elsewhere. So I want to read a brief Cavafy poem that's called At the Theater in his honor and memory. I was bored looking at the stage and raised my eyes to the boxes. There in a box, I saw you with your strange beauty and dissolute youth. All they told me about you this afternoon came back to mind at once and aroused my thought and my body. And as I gazed enthralled at your weary beauty, your weary youth, your stylish dress, I fantasized and pictured you the way they spoke of you this afternoon. It's for Wally. Rest in peace.
Yeah, it's strange. I think it is strange how we all know someone who's older who, even if they don't have COVID, are now isolated. My mother-in-law lives alone, and before this, of course, she had many visitors, members of the family, grandchildren, and so on. But I think since March 15th, she hasn't had anyone visit her. And I think she's unraveling much more quickly than she would have. She's 89. And it's not good for anybody to not to be alone. But if you're 89, it's really not good for you at all. So yeah, it's very interesting how difficult this is on people being alone. So Felicia, when you were writing this book, well, let me jump to when we were putting together the catalog of this book. The poem that we think of as being the quintessential poem is that election night poem, and obviously we put that in the catalog. That kind of summed it up for us. But when you were thinking of the framing of the concepts of this book, obviously a lot of this had to do with what it felt like to be in a Latina body when someone like Trump gets elected. But how else would you frame the concepts of this book?
Well, so I started writing the book on November 1, 2016, and it was largely because I had decided that I was going to join the Tupelo 30 for 30, which is it's like a fundraising thing where you write 30 poems in 30 days. And in reality, I think there was a little bit of idealism in my mind that that Trump was not going to win the election. And so I started off writing the poems, really thinking about space and the idea of leading up to sort of these big moments, but just my own humanity. And then as soon as the election night happened, the book turned and the book wrote itself. It was almost a requirement that I had to write these poems. There was nothing that I could do. It poured out of me. The considerations of, the moment of being almost in tears. I feel that echo of friends calling me right after the election saying, I don't know how to navigate. I can't go to work. People think that I'm supposed to be okay with this. And so there's eerily sort of the same situation that's happening during the pandemic. But there was a lot going on, I think, on a larger level of thinking about systems and what's broken and how we allow elected officials to speak for us, how the Electoral College is this broken system, and yet we still allow it to govern. The last election, the majority vote was actually not Trump, right? And yet right. The Electoral College governed that. Like, why are we just allowing in this country to go with something that's really messed up and broken? And politics are, this is the most political book I've ever written. One could argue poetry is all political, right? But this really talks about it outward, and it says what needs to be said in a way that's meant to be, digestible and clear in many ways. And I'm so happy that this book is in the world right now, because I read these poems and it's an echo of today. Mm-hmm. Really is.
Right, because we get to make this decision again.
Yeah. And I feel that same tension. I hear Democrats saying, I refuse to vote for Biden. And I get that. It's like, is Biden the best candidate? It's a broken system, right? Now we have this right. candidate. And does that mean that if you don't vote for Biden, are you supporting Trump? Well, no, it doesn't. However, the Electoral College is making it out that it's going to be interesting.
Right.
And so I just feel like this election is also, overshadowed with all that's happening of us being in the unknown, the upside down.
Right.
The fear that's going on, but then also the joy. There's this utter amount of joy that's also happening that's going on too, that I think that's getting me just as much, to see the true humanity coming out and people being generous to each other is striking and stunning.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I've been watching all the stuff Richard Blanco's been doing for poetry, and it's really stunning. But yeah, I agree with you that of polarizing elections, there's just been nothing like the last election. When I have been in England and at the London Book Fair and at the Frankfurt Book Fair, people always ask me because they always say I can be friends with somebody who voted on the other side of the Brexit argument because there might be reason, and I hesitate because it's hard for me to imagine the context under which I could say I'm friends with someone, or I had someone at dinner the other night who is a Trump supporter. I can't imagine ever having someone at dinner at my house who is a Trump supporter. Under what circumstances would I do that? And because it's I feel so strongly about his racism, his homophobia, his hatred of everything I stand for. And so a line was drawn in the sand at the last election in a way that it had never been as far as the Republican Party. So yeah, in your book for me really encapsulated so many of those issues so well, and you just roared this book.
Well,
So
I'm terrified that it's going to happen again, and that Trump is going to get reelected. And I think of, would COVID have swept through the country that it's doing right now if we actually had a leader, if we had a competent human being who was running this country? Would it be like it is now?
yeah, I mean, we're coming up on 100,000 deaths very quickly here. Yeah, and it's hard to say. It's hard to say. So Francisco, tell us about the writing of After Ruben.
Well, I guess I'll start by unpacking the title a little bit. Ruben is a reference to the Nicaraguan poet Ruben Darío, who died in 1916 in his late 40s. Was sort of the godfather of Spanish language modernismo, not to be confused with English language modernism. And so in some ways, he and his work are sort of the book's muse. In fact, there's an appendix in the book that contains 10 of his poems in the original Spanish. His work is in the public domain. And one of the threads of this book are taking those 10 Spanish language poems and including English language versions or imitations in the book itself, interspersed. So one of the projects or agendas of the book is one that has to do with experimental ways of translating poetry. The other thing about the book is that it includes an essay at the very end titled My Ruben. It's broken up into 3 parts. And the third part of that essay deals with the controversy that arose a few years ago with regard to Ruben Darío and some private archive that revealed 9 letters that he wrote to the Mexican poet Amado Nervo, in which it was revealed that he had been in an intimate relationship with Amado Nervo in the early part of the 20th century. And so that new biographical information caused me to revision some of those translations and to adjust them accordingly. Another thread in the book has to do with my father, to whom the book is dedicated. My father passed away in 2018. He wasn't part of my life growing up, but my siblings and I reconnected with him after my mother died. And I spent time with him many years ago. And some of the stories that he shared with me make their way into some of the poems in this book. I guess another muse of this book is the poet Jack Spicer. When I came up with the title After Ruben, I was thinking about Spicer's book After Lorca, which is also a book that includes translation as one of its projects, but translation in a very playful way. The book includes translated poems by Lorca, but also invented translations of poems that don't exist. And Jack Spicer had Lorca write the introduction to his book, which is interesting because Lorca died in 1936 and the book was written in 1960 something. So just to give you an idea, to have someone deceased pen your introduction gives you an idea of the playfulness that Spicer was enacting. And there is a poem in the book that is in the voice of Darío, From the Grave. And it's sort of a poem that tries to set the record straight, so to speak, in a manner of speaking. So it's my Nicaragua book in ways that my first two books were not. Yeah.
You know, I am also, Spicer has, you know, he has a complicated humanity, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But that book After Lorca is a pinnacle book for me in many, many ways. And so I was so happy to see your title. I knew that like eventually someone was going to put something out that had the meaning behind it as well. And your book is very beautiful.
He was a curmudgeon. I don't know if you've, there's a wonderful, wonderful biography of him called Poet Be Like God, written by the late Kevin Killian. I forget who his co-author was, but it's a wonderful portrait of literary San Francisco in the late 50s and early 60s. But yeah, he was, I can imagine he would not be a person easy to get along with.
Yeah. Sure.
Well, many poets are not easy to get. As a publisher poet. So of exciting things that have happened with both of your books so far, what has been the most exciting thing? Felicia?
You know, I think any moment that someone contacts me and says, I've read your book. And I actually don't even have to know what came after it. Just the whole, I read your book. It's so meaningful to have someone take your art and ingest it and then reach out to you as an author. I mean, as artists, that's why we're here, right? We're in a conversation in our poetics. And my hope is that over time that more people will reach out and say that they've read it. I'll have conversations with people who are potentially writing books in a similar vein, who are interested in contemporary Latinx poetry, but also in infusing both the intimate with the you know, the largely political and what that looks like. And you know, I'd love to say a review that comes out and all that stuff. Those are all great too, but those personal messages are really, and through my website or however, even if I don't know the person, I'm just like, oh my goodness, someone read it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I feel like that every time. I like, you know, when my last book came out, every time someone came up to me and said, I read your book, because I feel like I always try to make this point to graduate students, and you both teach, so I'm sure you can appreciate this, but, you know, I explain to them, like, I'm someone that loves art a lot. Yeah. And what I really like is to go into someone's art studio, and because then you kind of get to see art being made, right? And usually you can just walk around and in like 10 minutes, you can just be like, oh, I see you're in a deer phase, or, you know, you're doing paintings of the moon or something like that, right? And like 10 minutes, you can take it all in. You can see what phase they're in, right? Mm-hmm. But when you ask someone to read a book of poetry, you're asking for a huge amount of focus, concentration. They can't just be like standing there with a beer in their hand, kind of zipping around your studio. They can't just look at you dancing. They have to stop and be fully engaged in reading your book. And so you're asking a lot of your reader. And so for someone to have read your book and actually reached out to you and told you that they read it and that they liked it, you know, that is amazing, you know. So for every reader out there, I'm always dazzled. I'm with you. I'm always dazzled with every reader that we have. And I would also disagree with you when you were saying earlier that all poetry is political. I think that some poetry is meant to kind of give us awakening or a pleasant moment, because like I really like Mary Oliver's poetry, but I'm not sure it's all political. I mean, when you're walking around the pond and so on, I think you're waking up, with the pond and so on. I'm not sure it's really political to walk around the pond. I think it's supposed to be meditative, In fact, I think it's supposed to be getting away from the political to the pond,
Yeah. I do think that the form of poetry tends to be an act of politics, or what people say,
right,
because it's against the narrative. It's against the colloquial language. It's and so I don't know. I don't know if all poetry is political. I would actually say, if we're talking about expression, probably not. Form perhaps.
Yeah. But I always tell my graduate students, to kind of think about what it is you want to write about. If you want to write about politics, that's really hard. It's easier to write about the pond. But Francisco, what about you?
More than exciting, I like the term meaningful. And in light of the story I shared earlier about my friend Wally, on February 12th, even though the book was not officially out, the Arts Club of Washington invited me to give a reading. They have a new series that they do every now and then called Poetry Luncheons. And I was invited to give a brief reading and to sort of be a guest and answer questions about the book. And that was one of the few times that we were able to get Wally out of his home, and he actually got to go to the reading. And so that was very meaningful for him to be in the front row and to be able to hear me read from the book. And I haven't given many. I've only given, I think, 2 in-person readings. The one in Washington, and then one in San Antonio at AWP. And that's it. There hasn't been any more in-person readings. So those 2 readings are really looking really special right now from this vantage point. It's also been meaningful to just see the book become part of the conversation. And by that, I mean, whatever reviews it might get, however modestly, I was very pleased to see that that it garnered a micro review in American Poets by Stephanie Burt. I was very glad to see that it got a shout out at Booklist. And then the poet critic, Urayawan Noel, a Puerto Rican poet, who was also a professor at NYU, he did a wonderful gesture about a week or so ago, in which he wrote micro reviews for 10 new Latinx books, and then mentioned 20 books as a gesture. And his micro review of my book, I thought, was one of the most astute things I've read. He was able to capture all the main points in 200 words. Wow. So that's been really gratifying, just to see that the book is making its way into the world and is part of a national conversation.
I think as both of you reach out to people that teach poetry and want to teach Latin poetry, your books will both continue to find their way into the hands of graduate students, and that's kind of what will continue to make them become part of the conversation on an MFA level, and I think that will be great for both of you. So as we move forward with your book, both of your books, I think that as the year progresses, we obviously hope that there will be more in-person events as the year goes on. We at Red Hen think of a book as a new book, a poetry book particularly as a new book for like 6 to 18 months. So we are ready to continue promoting your books for as long as we need to, particularly during a time like this. So are you both hoping to do in-person events as 2020 progresses? If anybody's watching you and would like to have you do either a virtual event or an in-person event, you guys are interested?
I'm interested. I mean, I'm that, or also you mentioned classes. One of the things I'm looking forward to, on May 19th, I'm going to be a guest in a class that's originating out of UC Davis. My writer friend Macea Montoya is teaching the book to his class, and so I'm going to be a Zoom guest. And he has 26 students who have all read the book, and I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to engage with a group of students who have actually had the chance to read the book. And I'm also doing an event on May 29th with Roy Guzman, whose debut collection just came out with Grey Wolf, Catrachos. And we're going to be moderated by the DC-based poet Dan Vera. And I'm looking forward to just being in dialogue with Roy and with Dan. In terms of in-person events, I don't know. I'm not sure when that's going to start to happen. I'm not sure. I mean, in theory, the Los Angeles Times Book Festival has been rescheduled for mid-October. I don't know if it's going to happen or not. I don't know.
Yeah. And I'm open to opportunities that come my way, and I do feel that the life of this book is beyond its birth, and so yeah, I know that the first whatever months are important, but I feel that everyone has to focus on their own humanity right now, and it will call to those who find it, maybe. And I do think that longevity might also be in our favor right now as well. I'm so excited of all the Latinx books that are coming out kind of in general throughout in the United States, but also kind of on a world level. And they talk to each other too. I mean, the books are talking into a very interesting and unique conversation. And I think we're going to find that there's going to be some ebbs and flows of literature that's coming out right now, poetry that's coming out now is going to have resurgence of life depending upon what tangents of conversation with other books that it comes into. So yeah, I'm really open, but I do think, just like Francisco, I'm not sure when in-person is going to happen again. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with when in-person does happen again. I think the book will still have its own life. It will be it'll be a little different. It'll be a turtle, not a hare. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke with a writer the other day, and she said that she had been invited to do a lot of Zoom events. And she said, I'm just going to wait. I'm not going to do any Zoom events. I'm going to wait till next year and plan on doing in-person events when they're available. And I was just like thinking, why would you do that? Because I mean, like, I was not familiar with Zoom at all when this all started, but I've just like, when Toby first told me I was going to be doing Zoom, I was like, I'm going to be doing what? Say what? and and then Toby's just like, you're going to be doing it like tomorrow. And I was like, okay. And we all just jumped in and started doing it.
Yeah.
So I think that it's good now that COVID is upon us to jump in and swim with this. And one of the things that we're finding is that that this is an opportunity to have more and more conversations with people you couldn't have conversations with. So, for example, the chances that we three people would be having a conversation today in the same room isn't that good. Right? I don't think we would have flown Francisco to Los Angeles and you to Los Angeles, Felicia, for this conversation, but we're having it.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think the one thing that I would really like us to think about is like, what Latinx poets would we like to have in a room? And think about like what we did at AWP. How could we duplicate different versions of that? And because, the sky is the limit right now in terms of who you could have in a room. So I don't want to go too far with that because that will mess up Toby's idea of what a perfect StreamYard is. But I want to introduce the idea to you, and I will just say to you that last week, Mark was on a Zoom call with Scott Kelly, the astronaut.
Really?
So I encourage both of you to dream of who you two think that Red Hen should set up a Latinx Zoom with. And as we progress into the summer, we're going to finish out the book launches, and then we want to have once a month, kind of conversations that would be kind of really important, cool conversations. We want one of them to be a big Latinx book conversation. So give us some ideas. So I wanted to end this with another big question or thought for both of you. As we look at the data that's sort of coming out of COVID, obviously one of the big things that's coming out is that COVID is hitting the African American and Latino communities much harder than it should be. And part of that, it seems to be that there's more essential workers in the Latinx communities. Mark and I, when we were driving here, noticed a lot of Latinos working in the fields, still picking vegetables and that kind of thing. But there's also just a lot of people still doing essential work. I am assuming there are more people that are still, doing all kinds of essential work that are Latinx and African American. But there may be also people working in crowded conditions. I think this is too soon for them to have really figured out all the causes that there are more people of color. In your future writing, what kind of poetry or writing do you think will come out of looking at those kinds of facts?
Well, this is another broken system. We're talking about class. Because if you look at poverty numbers and class numbers in the United States right now, African American and Latinx individuals are the highest of in the poverty range in the country. And so we're talking about access. I mean, if in my mind, if we were to bar chart this, in a graph, we would see a correlation of access happening with COVID. The individuals who can't afford to shelter in place, the essential workers like you were talking about, but also just the living
right.
situations, where people have to live closer together,
right.
and that happens in cities. We see poverty in cities tends to impact both Latinx and African American individuals more, and so, I mean. This is the taboo conversation that this country hates to talk about, which is class.
Yeah.
And it's highly tethered to ethnicity and to culture and to race in this country. And like I said, it's a broken system. And this is just another indicative example of why we need to fix things. We cannot let this country keep going thinking that, more deaths are happening to people of color, so I'm a white individual living in X state and I can navigate and not wear a mask and go out and eat in a restaurant, and that's okay. No, that's not okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to rant, but this is something very close to me.
Right.
That we also forget that class is fluid.
Right.
Any minute we could lose a job, we could lose an opportunity, and all of a sudden we are in the poverty line again, right?
Right.
And so
right.
Any individual in this country, and I feel that that's forgotten about all the time.
Right. So you think that it's possible that because of this big issue that's happened, that perhaps more attention will be paid to this broken system?
I want to believe so, but I don't know with this country. I think that we are going to have to, we as in underrepresented populations, marginalized groups, women, queer and trans individuals, people with disabilities, people of color, we're going to have to claw tooth and nail to get it. But I think we have to, because we can't keep letting this happen.
Yeah. I mean, when you get statistics like over 100,000 Black people in Detroit didn't have running water when this started, and were heating up water on the stove, and that's how they were working the running water. That's just beyond shameful. And there's just more factors like that coming out. So I'm hoping that there will be more writing on this and more awareness that come out from poets and prose writers,
and playwrights. I mean, I'm envisioning, a year from now, 2 years from now, what kind of plays will emerge. From what we're all living through right now.
Right. Yeah, I definitely see novels, plays, poems, because the arts are part of what make us all wake up, you know. And both of your books are books that help people wake up, and I'd love to see more of that, because we don't live in a sunny little world. We need more waking up to happen.
Yeah, and in many ways, art is the prism that keeps changing the light and changing the light and changing the light until we can see it. And it depends on who's looking at it, right?
Right.
And how it keeps changing. And I believe that art has the power to be activism in itself. But of course, that's deeply attached to us as artists, and also to activists who are not artists, who are out on the front lines doing the work that needs to be done. I want to believe so much that COVID is going to lift a veil for many things in this country, but we're still going to have to fight for it, and maybe even harder this time.
I mean, you looked at, with Hurricane Katrina, there was a slight lifting of the veil, but it didn't change the narrative. But I like what you're saying very much, the idea that art is the prism that changes the light. Very, very, very well said. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful ending note. But if you have a better ending note, Francisco, I open the door to you.
I'm going to end by reading a poem.
Oh, please do. Please do.
I mentioned earlier that my father is one of the strands in this book, and so this is a poem in his voice, and it's the result of a story he told me. And I suppose one of the things I think is happening in this poem is to not romanticize, to tell the truth about family, including family dysfunction. That's all I'll say. It's called Academia Escolar, Managua, the 40s. Her look could undo not the most soothing thing I could say. The day they said we'd be let out early, a bubbly mood spread among us as we planned the afternoon. Impromptu stickball, that dusty lot. The academy's front gate clicked shut behind us when someone saw her behind a car, arms folded across her chest. I had no reason to, but that unexpected sight made me flinch. An 8-year-old child, frightened. Think about it. A boy, afraid of his mother. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you both so much for being here. And leave you with this. I hope what we find more of in time of COVID is love. Thank you so much.
Bye.